Good afternoon, y'all. We're going to be going straight into it, y'all. And we're going to be in Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew 14, and we're going to be starting in verse 22. So to get us a little bit of a heads up of what's kind of happening right now, kind of the narrative of what's going on, we start to realize at the beginning of this chapter, what was happening is just then the death of John the Baptist had happened, okay? And so there was a type of mourning there. There was a type of gloom that was happening at that moment, that they were just not that happy. They were mourning for the loss of John the Baptist. And then something very amazing happens. A miracle happens where Jesus has the ability to feed the 5,000. Jesus goes with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and turns this into feeding thousands upon thousands of people. And so at this very moment, you see that we're kind of getting close to this pinnacle of Jesus' walk, where there's thousands of people following him. He's doing miracles, and people are just wanting to get more and more of Jesus. Something so phenomenal, something so great that we love so much. And then something very interesting happens, because he starts to break off. He gets to a moment where he's around a lot of people, and then he starts to break off. And that's what we're going to get into today. And we're going to start in verse 22 of chapter 14 in Matthew, where it says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them." So we start to realize here exactly what I had said before, that Jesus had separated himself away from everybody, from the disciples, from the crowds, from everything that was going on around the world at that very moment, for one specific reason: to get time with God, to get time with his Father. Because what he had realized was that he was drained, that yes, he was doing amazing things, phenomenal things, miracles, but he never wanted to lose sight of the greatest thing he had, and that was a relationship with God. That was the ability to be able to speak to God, that same ability that we have today. And I find it interesting, this story, because of the time that we're in right now, because most of us have such busy lives. We have so many things to do. We have school, we have work, we have athletics, we have academics, we have so many things around us that tend to take away that time that we have with God. But then this crazy thing, this crazy virus that has come amongst us all, has separated that all from us. And it's tough. But what we start to realize in this time of quarantine is that this is a phenomenal time, if we take it in a positive way, to grow that relationship with God that maybe we have separated ourselves away from. So we start to realize here at the beginning that if we can take this step, we can realize that there is something positive of being able to separate ourselves from the world that's happening at this moment, and realizing that at this very moment, the biggest thing that we can do is always draw closer to God. Always see the positive. Always see the things that we can do for ourselves, for our relationship with God. And then we start to dig into it, where it gets really interesting into the story in verse 25, where it says,
What chapter? Say the chapter again.
Chapter 14. "And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.'" So, to kind of turn it into what it is happening right now, we start to realize that this could be a very moment that's happening right now in our lives, is that when times of when things are normal, when times of things going very smoothly, when we start to see something abruptly happen, such as this virus happening, coming across the nations, across the world, you start to realize that there's an instant feeling of fear. There's an instant thought of fear. And we start to look around and think to ourselves, why, what, and who is this? what is the reason behind this, and why is this happening at this very moment? And we start to realize that this is the same kind of fear that is happening with the disciples right now that are sitting in that boat. They're sitting in that boat looking out and wondering, is this a ghost? Is this some type of interterrestrial being that's coming after us and definitely threatening our lives? And that is the exact thought, because the storm is here, because they're not in a very safe place right now in their life. And they realize that something is coming and confronting them, and it doesn't seem to be good. But the interesting thing about it is, as they look out, the voice of Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And I feel like that same voice is here today. That same voice is telling us in this very moment to take heart, to not worry, to maybe not understand what's going on, but to realize that I am in control. That Jesus is in control of the things around us. That yes, we cannot tell ourselves what can happen tomorrow. We cannot tell ourselves that we can completely separate ourselves from all the things that are happening at this moment. But we can realize this, that the Almighty God, the creator of the universe, is here, and he is able to provide for us, and he is able to protect us in all times as we go through this life. So the fear that we have of what could be is not a fear that we should have, but something that we should understand, that if letting go of control, if letting go of the things of what is to come, and allowing God to work through us, allowing us to take the steps that God has for us, and the calling that he has for us in this moment. Because I promise you, it is not ideal, the things that we are going through, but what is ideal is a plan that God has for us. And if we are allowing ourselves to work in that, we can always find a light in a dark time. We can always find some type of glimpse of him in even the darkest of times, where we can be the light that we are called to be. But if we keep going forward, I love this part, and it's one of my favorite parts of Peter, where it says, "And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. I love this part where he starts to break down kind of what Peter's personality is. And we always see Peter as the one that's going to abruptly say something in the times where he probably shouldn't say anything. He's going to honestly have fear when he's supposed to have fear, and possibly crumble when he should stand up for God. But at this moment is the biggest moment I find with Peter. One of the biggest leaps of faith that I find with Peter. One of my favorite stories of him. Because instantly, without a shadow of a doubt, he says, "Okay, Jesus, if that's you, if that's the Jesus that I just saw feed the 5,000, if that's the Jesus that I've seen do all these miracles and tell of all these parables and admit to me that he is the Son of God, then I want to do what you're doing right now. I want to step up. I want to stand out. I want to do what everybody thinks I can't do, because I'm not going to do it on my own, but I'm going to do it with you." And that is where Peter's at right now. And Peter says, "Tell me to come out there, Jesus, if it is you." And so Jesus says, "Come." And you see, y'all, this is exactly where we can be at in life. Some of us have been in situations already where we've been like that, where we felt like we are having a pull at us, we are having a tug at us, telling us to do something that we know we should do, that might leave us out of our comfort zone, lead us into something that is very uncomfortable for us. But we understand that through that, we'll be right by Jesus' side, right in the plan that God has for us. Because I promise you, as Peter looks out into that water, he doesn't think that alone he can do this. I promise you that he doesn't look out on this with a boastful, with a confident feel, saying, "I am walking on water on my complete own." But through the things that he had seen Jesus do, he had understood that through Jesus, he very well could do this. So as the storms were coming, as the storms were raging around him, he takes a step. A measly step, a step of faith, because he fully, completely believed that the person out there on the water was Jesus. And y'all, we're going to have to take some steps coming forward soon in our own lives. We're going to have to take some steps of faith. Because the problem of this world at the moment is that they have put us into this box. They have given Christians the ability to be able to worship on their own, to be able to do their own things in a church building, to be able to have their own thing going on at youth. But they wanted to isolate us and put us in a box and say, as long as you don't step up, as long as you don't step out, it's all good. As long as you don't try to just push everything on everybody else, try to push the narrative of what's good and what's bad, what's wrong and what's morally correct, that is great. As long as you stay in your box, that is fine. But you see, we're at a moment in life, y'all, where we have to make a decision. And the thing is at this very moment, as this world starts to crumble, as this world starts to feel a little bit of pain and fear, we feel like at this very moment is the greatest time for us to step out of that box, for us to step out and leap, for us to be able to step out onto the waters, onto grounds that are so uncomfortable for us, and to be able to be the light that God has called us to be. But it takes one step, one measly step, a hard step, but then pushing forward into the light of Christ, being the nearest to Christ at that very moment. Because we never know what can happen if we step up, if we step out. But we understand this, that in times like this, we must step up, just as Peter did. But we go on to read the rest where it says, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" So we realize here that Peter gets into a stumbling block. What I find for him to do was the hardest thing was get out of the boat. So what I felt like in this story when I start to look at it the first couple of times is Peter, how can you start to sink? How can you start to lose faith at the time where I felt like faith was the easiest, where you were closest to Jesus, where you had already taken the biggest leap and started to walk on water? But I started to realize that when I looked into my own life and the struggles that I had, I looked around and I realized that same moment in his life, in Peter's life, was the same moment that I have had over and over again growing up. Was that at some moment I would get the energy, I would get the strength, and I would have the faith to step up. At one moment I would have the faith to stand out. And at the moments where I felt like I was at the pinnacle of my relationship with God, I started to realize that I started to slip. When I felt like I was even at my closest of my relationship with God, something started to slowly sink in. Doubt started to slowly sink in. Started to have a lack of faith with specific things, temptations of the world, things that I had struggled with before, and things that I would come to struggle with after. And I started to realize that in that very moment, I understood Peter completely. I understood how he could step out, how he could step up, how he could be that light. And I started to realize that I could understand completely why he sunk. But what was the greatest thing about this is how it ends. The greatest thing that we can't miss, because we only think about Peter sinking, is verse 31 when he says, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. Jesus immediately took out his hand and took hold of him. That's something we have to grasp. Because y'all, if we're standing in the boat, we can be saved by Jesus. Jesus can do anything. But if we're standing in the boat and the storm starts to crash, when we're our farthest distance away from Jesus and the storm is crashing everywhere and things are starting to fall apart, would you rather be in the boat farthest away from Jesus, or would you rather be able to be even an arm's distance away from Jesus? Because y'all, we're all going to slip. We're all going to fall sometimes. But the people that are closest to God, the people that are closest to Jesus, when Jesus starts to call out to you, you'll be able to hear his voice. You'll be able to see his hand. And when you're looking directly at Jesus on the path that God has called you to be on, you start to realize this, that it's so much easier to grab hold of his hand when you're outside of the boat taking those leaps than it is to stay in the boat and feel like you're in your comfort zone. Because outside of that comfort zone, when you are being uncomfortable, you are your closest to Jesus. You're doing the things that we're called to do as Christians. When we do that, and we start to realize that, because we always want to think of how Jesus says he has little faith. Peter has little faith, but we always want to forget the beginning. But we start to realize here the thing that helped Peter the most was his initial faith. His initial foundation that he had with Jesus. The things that he had seen work in his life, the things that he had seen Jesus work into other people's life, and he started to realize at that moment that Jesus could do the best things ever and that he wanted to be the closest to him. And I'm asking you to do the same thing today. I'm asking you to be the light that Peter was. Because as he stepped out, the disciples looking from the outside are thinking, oh my goodness, this dude is crazy. They're thinking to himself, are you absolutely insane, Peter? Why are you walking on the water onto somebody we cannot see? But we start to realize that's faith exactly in its purest form. Because Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. The substance of things hoped for, the things that we hope for, the hope that we have for heaven, for eternal life, for the things that God promises us as we are followers of Christ, and the evidence of things not seen, because we may not be able to see Jesus in the physical form, but we can see the things that he does in our lives. We can see the things that he's done for this world, for the things that we are called according to his purpose. But that's through the faith that we have. And we're called to take that leap. And that leap is found with our initial foundation. Our initial foundation of faith. That when we do that, we'll be our closest to Jesus. But as we start to wrap up tonight, we start to realize this. That if we do everything we're called to do, if we are as Peter sometimes and rambunctious and just do things without thinking, we start to realize that when we're built on the correct foundation, when we're built with faith, when we're built with the things that the Bible has called us to be, and we're constantly building our relationship with God as we spoke about at the beginning, and we start to take those leaps, we start to realize as we look back, we start to realize that we're not alone. Because as we keep our eyes on Jesus, y'all, if we as a group, as a family, as a community of followers, Christians, as a whole, collectively together can find something great in this, find a light in this dark moment in this world, we start to realize this, that together as a unit, as a complete whole, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we can do something very special. But in closing, I'm going to tell you a story. And the story dates back to World War II. And it's about this cruiser that was just driving along for us as it was going across. And when it started to realize that they had gotten a lock on them from an enemy. And in a moment, in an instance, they had been bombed. 300 soldiers in that cruiser crashed to the water. They crashed to the Atlantic Ocean at that very moment in the season. It was freezing cold. And what you started to realize was outside of that moment where the waters were crashing, the waves were going, you started to realize that the current was separating them very quickly and at a rapid rate. But a young lieutenant found himself around 8 other guys, 9 soldiers as a whole, collectively as a group. And they started to talk as their iced veins started to just crumble, as they started to feel as if their whole body was shaking and they were falling apart. They started to talk. And the interesting question that starts to arise is, are you scared? Do you have fear? And the answer would be absolutely. The answer would be absolutely. I have fear right now. I am in a situation that is out of my control. I am out in the middle of water that is freezing cold, that is not good for my body, and I know that I cannot just call somebody to help me. I know that nobody really knows that I'm out here. I have fear. But the young lieutenant was very interested by how they started to say the end of that. Because it was absolutely, I am in fear. But it wasn't, I am in fear for my own life. But it is, I am in fear that I will not be able to get back to my family. I am in fear that I will not be able to get back and provide for my kids. That I won't be able to see my son or my daughter grow up. I am in fear for some of the things that I will miss out on as people grow up. I cannot be there for my wife. I cannot support my wife. Those are the things that I fear. Something far different than what I would think. What the young lieutenant would think. Because he's thinking, why are you not fearing just yourself, but fearing others in the moment where you're about to die? But they started to realize this simple thing. That these people had a why. They had a why for what they did. They had a why for why they were going to fight till the very end of their lives. And as they constantly talked, hour after hour after hour, and they constantly just kept digging into stories about their life, stories about their kids, stories about their wives, stories about what could happen if they could get back, stories of positivity, of things that could happen. Days started to go by, and exactly 6 days later, an Allied bomber flies over and sees them. And as they start to see him, they start to curve around, they start to come over, and they pick them up, each one by one. 9 soldiers to be exact. And what you start to realize here is that only 9 soldiers survived. Out of 300 people, the 9 soldiers that started to constantly talk about their why, that started to talk about the reasons why they do things, their family, their people, their kids, all the things that got them going, kept them alive. And I want to ask you why. Why do you live today? Why are you here? Why can you do better? And we got to grab hold of that. Because why are we here? Why have we not stepped out? Because if we start to realize why we do the things we do, if we start to realize why we crave a relationship with God, we start to realize that nothing can get in between that. We start to realize that this why can bury us and grow us into something so special. Why do we want more? Why do we crave that relationship with God? And do we want more? Do we want to be the light for our family? Do we want to be the light for our friends around us that we're called to be? Because in this unprecedented time, in a time where it's almost tough to really know what tomorrow holds, we can only understand one thing, that our relationship with God is never wavering. Our relationship with God can never be taken away from us no matter what. And if we can grab hold of that, if we can step out like Peter did into that water, and we can step out into our communities, amongst our families, amongst all the things that we're called to be, we could be a light that this generation's dying for, that's craving for it. And we can do it right now in the world's most vulnerable time. But we're going to close in prayer tonight, and that will be it for us throughout this live stream. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for allowing us to come and learn more about you, Lord. And I pray that as we go forth throughout our lives, that we can constantly draw closer to you. And even in this time of quarantine where we feel like we may not have much to do, that we understand that this is a great time for us to really reflect on our lives with you, reflect on our time with you in our relationship, and understand that we can build great routines of reading the Bible, of praying, of just drawing closer to you in these times. And as we start to come back to the world, and the world starts to come back and be normalized, we can realize that at this moment we can be a light in a weird time, that we can be the light that we're called to be, the disciples that we're called to be as Christians, Lord, to be the steps that you've been begging us to do, so that we know that we're on the path that you have called us to be on instead of our own. And understanding that that is unprecedented land, and it's tough for us because it's out of our control. But being in control with you is the greatest control. Understanding that your path is the greatest path, and it leads us to salvation. It leads us to a relationship with you and eternal salvation. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.
You gotta tell them like we're done.
Yeah, and that'll be it for us. Thank you.